Um, I'm a board member, as David said, of World Beyond War and also of Australians for War Powers Reform. And here in Australia, we now have 2 chapters of World Beyond War, and so we're beginning to expand our influence, I hope. What I'm going to do today is, first of all, say to you that we are coming to you from the traditional unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, that's in Sydney, as well as from the Widjabul Wia-bal land of the Bandjalung Nation. That is in Lismore, which is in northern New South Wales. And the reason for those both is that later in the program, we're going to switch to Lismore Live, where they've got an event going on run by an organization called Peace in Our Time. And you're going to meet Sandra Handley, who's going to present that. Okay, so here we go. First of all, you're going to see an interview that I did with Senator David Shoebridge, who is a senator from New South Wales, and it was filmed for me a little while ago by Kathy Vaughan of Consortium News, and she has edited that for us, and I recommend it to you because David Shoebridge would have to be one of the most articulate opponents of the AUKUS agreement, about which you probably have heard. You'll hear more from him about that right now.
I should play the video. I take it I should play the video. I will play the video.
You got it? Yeah.
F-35 fighter jets are currently being used by the State of Israel to bomb Gaza. It's part of a genocide that has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians and damaged or destroyed over half of all buildings in Gaza. Just last week, Israel signed a fresh deal with US arms manufacturer Lockheed Martin to provide another 25 F-35 fighter jets to add to its existing fleet of approximately 50. Lockheed Martin has said that every F-35 across the globe contains Australian-made parts and components. The State of Israel would not be able to use its fleet of F-35 fighter jets in Gaza without parts and spares made in Australia. More than 70 Australian companies supply parts and components to the global supply chain for the F-35, including critical parts, which they're the sole global provider for, that allow fighter jets to drop their bombs. Collectively, Australia's corporate industry has some $4.6 billion in contracts for the F-35. At any point over the past 9 months, the Albanese government could have prohibited Australian-made weapons parts being provided to Israel, but it chose not to. When we say the Albanese Labor government is complicit in the genocide in Gaza, this is what we're talking about. The government, in this case, the Albanese Labor government, but with the backing of the other war party in the federal parliament, the coalition, seem absolutely committed to avoid telling the public the truth about the two-way arms trade that Australia engages with Israel, and also to be running this kind of fear campaign to try and make Australians agree to paying even more of their public wealth towards weapons as part of a US plan to encircle and threaten China. And I think these are two projects the Australian public broadly rejects. But particularly when it comes to the two-way weapons trade with Israel, our government has been silent on the fact that it's signed over $1.3 billion worth of fresh contracts with Israeli arms manufacturers since the Albanese government has come into power. And appallingly, we found out in February, in the middle of this appalling genocide, that the Albanese government had agreed to a $917 million contract with Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems at the moment are a key supplier to the Israeli military, making record profits from the war against the Palestinian people. and are selling the weapons to Australia on the basis that they've been battlefield tested against the Palestinian people, literally experimenting on the Palestinian people. And yet the Australian government felt quite comfortable entering a $917 million contract. I personally think the Australian public are deeply shocked by that. But there's also the fact that we're a significant supplier of weapons and weapons parts to Israel, which unquestionably makes us complicit in the genocide. Not only are we a critical supplier of components to the F-35 fighter jet, which the Netanyahu government is repeatedly sending over Gaza to release weapons that are unquestionably killing Gazan civilians, but we're also critical suppliers of parts to drones that are used by the Israeli military, components in Spike missiles that are manufactured by another Israeli arms manufacturer called Rafael, and supplying things like armoured steel to Israeli tanks and armoured personnel carriers. And yet our government, our foreign minister, repeatedly says, in words that I can only call a direct lie, that Australia does not supply weapons to Israel and hasn't supplied weapons for the last 5 years. That's patently false and is increasingly called out by the UN and by global weapons exports. So not only are we complicit in this, but our government's actually directly lying to us about the extent of the complicity, which I find, it's a double betrayal of the public. Senator Wong, the foreign minister, has gone beyond that. She has said repeatedly, both in the Senate when I've asked her and also in public, and got her political followers in the Labor Party to repeat the lie, that Australia has not sent any weapons to Israel for at least the last 5 years and isn't sending any now. That's become a kind of Labor mantra that they repeat, and it's patently false. Penny Wong's own department publishes data about global exports by Australia, and her own data says that Australia has exported directly to Israel at least $11 million of arms and ammunition in the last 5 years. That's almost certainly a substantial underreporting of arms exports, and it doesn't include weapons parts and weapons systems that find their way to Israel indirectly, either through the US, through the United Arab Emirates, or through European distributors. It is extraordinary that the foreign minister will repeat that false mantra, and particularly given more than 250 weapons export permits have been issued by the Australian government to export weapons or civilian items that could be used as weapons to Israel in the last 5 years. None of it is credible. And especially in circumstances where Australian manufacturers have repeatedly, until October of last year, were repeatedly trumpeting their sales of weapons parts and weapons systems to Israel. I mean, it's extraordinary that she continues with that line when we know it's false. I think all Australians should be concerned about the fact that there's a secret foreign military base right in the centre of Australia, which Australian politicians are denied access to. The Australian Parliament is not told what occurs there, and the Australian public absolutely are in the dark about what happens in Pine Gap. It's called a joint facility, but we should be frank about it. It's a US-run facility where a couple of Australians trot in as do secondary roles. It's very likely that it's used to assist, at least for intelligence gathering, in relation to the war in Gaza. It could also be being used to help assist weapons targeting in Gaza, but the Australian government won't even ask the US government what it's been used for, let alone being open with the public about what Pine Gap's been used for. But do people really think it's consistent with us being a sovereign nation to have a secret US-run facility, notionally joint, but US-run facility in the heart of our country that could well be right now helping the Israeli military identify and target Palestinian people to kill? I don't feel comfortable with that. And I think any Australian who expects our country to have a kind of credible, independent foreign policy, I think will be troubled by that as well. We had a moment of confected outrage from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, when myself and one of my Green Senate colleagues, Senator Jordan Steelejohn from WA, asked her in estimates about, did Australia know if the B-52 bombers, the US B-52 bombers that Australia has invited to rotate through RAAF Tyndall, which is a large military airbase south of Darwin in the Northern Territory, we dared to ask whether or not the B-52 bombers that are rotating through Tyndall were nuclear armed. And I find it on one level amusing, but on the other kind of disturbing. We had this confected outrage from the foreign minister about how dare we ask that question? How dare we politicise this? Because there's a long-standing policy position from the Labor Party and the coalition to never ask the US if they're going to be nuclear armed. And, senators asking whether or not we were hosting a bomber fleet with doomsday weapons on them designed to kill millions of people was apparently some kind of offensive politicising of the issue, and that we should have just kept quiet and not ask. Don't ask, don't tell is the Australian government's official position on that, which I find utterly extraordinary. The idea that we would be opening up Australia to a fleet of nuclear-armed jet bombers, the B-52 bombers, and without even asking the question is utterly remarkable. And the confected outrage from the foreign minister is bizarre. And it goes to show just how far down the drain, the rabbit hole that they've got with the unquestioning reliance on the US alliance. But of course, I think we could take a step back as well and ask, well, why is the US desperate to be relocating all these strategic assets into Australia? So it's not just the expanded RAAF base in Tyndall for the B-52 bombers. Of course, there's been a long-standing Pine Gap. There's the Harold Holt facility in the northwest of Australia designed to communicate with US nuclear submarines, and almost certainly a critical part of designing a second strike to kill millions of people in the event of a nuclear confrontation. There's also the more recent relocation of 2,500 US Marines to Darwin. There's the Australia's combined efforts with the United States to build a forward attack base for US nuclear submarines just off Perth, HMAS Sterling in Garden Island off Perth. And there's a proposal to build another forward-facing US submarine attack facility on the east coast of Australia. And you ask yourself, well, why is the US locating all these assets into Australia? Is this a sign of, investment and strategic strength? Well, it's absolutely not. The US is relocating these assets into Australia because they realise that their existing forward bases in places like Guam or Okinawa are utterly non-viable in any conflict with China. Those bases will be annihilated in the first 24 hours of a conflict with China, and they're relocating them to an area that I think is more survivable on continental Australia. How long they'll be survivable for, I don't know, but it's far from a sign of US strength and a kind of strengthening commitment from the US into the region. It's a sign of US strategic weakness, and it is literally enmeshing us into the US warfighting plans in a way that is designed to tie the hands of future governments.
Since there is no threat that we can identify from China, their intention has to be aggressive. And if it's aggressive, then it is more likely to create the scenario that we most fear, that is, for the Chinese to find it necessary to attack Australia instead of, for instance, attacking the mainland United States. And why people in Australia who clearly see this can't get their point of view, despite your good efforts and those of Senator Steele-John, can't get their point of view through to the government and stop this process before it's too late, is something that concerns many people, I believe.
Well, it's not just the location of US bases and more US bases in Australia that should make people anxious. It's the extraordinarily foolish and reckless proposal for Australia to spend some 370 billion Australian dollars on acquiring nuclear submarines. The government's hoped for trajectory on nuclear submarines, which I think is highly unlikely to be met. But their proposal is that by the sort of late 2030s, Australia will have 5 nuclear submarines that will be probably purchased from US shipyards, which we would then be able to deploy, obviously on rotation, into the South China Sea. Now, if we have a fleet of 5 nuclear submarines, or let's assume that by the mid to late 2040s, everything goes amazingly well in their perspective, and we have 8 nuclear submarines, we're talking about having 2 or 3 nuclear submarines on station in the South China Sea, allegedly keeping us safer. Now, 2 or 3 conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines in the South China Sea is not a serious strategic asset. It just isn't. It wouldn't be a significant deterrent to China. It wouldn't provide any genuinely independent sovereign capacity against any kind of Chinese actions in the South China Sea. It's laughable to suggest otherwise. It only makes any kind of strategic sense, if you can call it that, as a subunit within the US military's overall deployment in the South China Sea. It only makes sense to be part of the US military's deployment, which is literally us buying a ticket at enormous expense to the next US war. We are consciously going out of our way to invite ourselves and to encourage the happening of a war between China and the United States. And far from making us safe, it's incredibly reckless and inviting conflict. I think we should remember that it's further from Beijing to Canberra than it is from Beijing to London. Beijing's closer to London than it is to Canberra, and yet we're inviting ourselves into a conflict with China as a secondary non-sovereign unit of the US military. It's extraordinary that that's the consensus between Labor and the coalition. And of course, if we did invite ourselves to the war and there was a hot conflict between the United States and China, and if the unthinkable happened and it escalated into even a limited nuclear exchange, well, if China was trying to come up with a target that would send a message to the United States but not invite a counterstrike against the Chinese mainland, they're far more likely to pick a target in Australia than they are to pick a target in continental United States. We are much, much more vulnerable in a limited nuclear exchange in that scenario than even the United States to a war that we will have no control over the start or end of. To call it reckless, I think, is an underestimation, Alison. If I, as the Greens defence post, tried to sort of corral people into a common position, I think that would quite reasonably face resistance. But I encourage community organisations and groups to find as much unity as possible, because we're much stronger together. And the more we can do this collectively, the more powerful we'll be.
Well, thank you for that encouragement. And thank you for spending so much time with us today. And let's hope that World Beyond War hears your message and ours everywhere.
Yeah, let's join that peace wave together. Thanks, Alison.
Great job, Alison.
Hey, thank you, Senator David Shoebridge. I'm going to hand over now to Sandra Handley and her colleagues in Lismore, where Peace in Our Lifetime is holding a series of events today. Peace in Our Lifetime is a global movement for peace that aims to be free, they say, free of anger, blame, historical, religious, racial, or national bias. And rather than focusing on what's wrong with the world or within conflicts, Peace in Our Lifetime promotes peace culture through blanketing the world with peace signs. Well, that's very close to something that World Beyond War is doing. Over to Sandra.
Sandra, your call. Sandra, it's over to you. Your call.
Oh boy.
Everybody, even right provided my report today. No, I think we're all right. Hello, Local Peace Way. Welcome to Lismore, Australia. We're Peace in Our Lifetime, and we want to welcome you to our event where we're making company inside. So come this way.
There's no video, and I'm not sure if people are understanding the audio.
I don't know.
Just give a wave to the
Over here.
It's Tony is doing our light spreading for us. Yes, no. And we're giving a wave to the peace wave. If everyone, if you all just move out here a bit, so I can sit down. And Auntie Jenny. So you're filming us.
Yeah, that's me. It must be
That's
filming with both cameras.
That's okay, I think. We're live.
Yeah, okay.
No. You need to be going the other way.
That's what I thought. But
Okay. Ah,
do it again. You want to do that a little bit again?
I think you heard us. I hope you heard us. Sorry that we didn't get our filming quite right, but I think we're on now.
Yeah.
So, welcome.
Okay.
Okay. So we'd like to start today with a welcome to country from Auntie Jenny.
Jingiwa, welcome. Jingala means hello. So what I will do is, it's not necessarily, there's a big contention at the moment about welcome and acknowledgement and stuff like that. So what I'd like to do is explain a bit about what we do. So when I do a welcome, I'm doing it directly from my family, who are direct blood descendants of the Widjabul Wia-bal people on the land that we are here today. For me, it's also significant doing it over south, over north, up on top of that hill. That's Sleeping Lizard Hill, which is a significant site to my people, but also to the people of Lismore in general. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, both past, who, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be allowed to do this show. Present ones. It's also future generations that are coming through. I'd like to also pay my respects to Juries that are here today on country, but also other Tories, which is our web Aboriginal, that are not on country that are here, but also pay my respect to you guys for being here. Because as we know, Australia's become a diverse community. It takes a whole lot of us to raise a community. And I think for Lismore, it's beautiful that everyone's coming together today. I don't know how everyone else feels, but for me, every time I turn the news on, there's something bad happening in the world or happening here in Australia. And I think we really, and I'm very supportive. And I'm thankful for Sandra for inviting me into this. So I guess for me, thank you, welcome. Spread the love, spread peace, because I don't know about you, but I'm sick of seeing hatred and anger all around the world. So, Google there, thank you, and everyone enjoy.
Thanks, everybody. So, so I'm Sandra Hadley, and we're from Peace in Our Lifetime, and we are supported by Northern Rivers Peace Group, Remembering and Healing. We came about just purely exactly what Jenny said, was there's so much anger and hatred and conflict in the world, and feeling of helplessness and hopelessness often comes up. It came up in me, absolutely. And what I thought was, we can't necessarily change immediately into the anger and the conflict, but what we can do is we can bring about peace, or bring about a culture of peace. So Peace in Our Lifetime aims to blanket the world in peace signs. Really simple. It's a small action that every single individual can take to place a peace sign in public and pass the message on to your networks and get them to place and pass on. So that's a simple way that we maybe, because we know the visual imagery and symbolism of signs can actually change people's feelings, behaviours, thoughts, and can create action. And you can imagine if we could do this around the whole world, that we blanketed it in peace signs, what that may do. So today we've moved from our beautiful creative peace signs that we've started working with, and we're moving into creating human peace sign. And I'd like to credit Liz for the idea, because Liz came up with this idea of, wow, if we took made human peace signs And then we're doing that today as part of the Global Peace Wave, but then we're going to take the film and send it through our networks across the world and get them to make human peace signs and film them. And we want to get that done for International Peace Day. So we're launching in Lismore, New South Wales, Australia. How cool is that? We are the first. And I just want, before we move into that process, I just want a couple of thank yous, because the thank yous are really important. Without the people, we would never get this done. Liz, thank you. Miriam and Tess from Flow Collective, who have helped to bring the concept together. Benny, who's coming to do some spiraling with us. Willem, Duncan, and Tony that are filming. Auntie Jenny for doing the country and our smoking ceremony. And thank you. Yes. Thank you. For having the crazy energy to make it happen. Just before I introduce Miriam, who's going to take us through the sign, I just want to say we were at the Lantern Parade yesterday. We marched in the Lantern Parade, and the energy that we got as Peace in Our Lifetime marching through the streets was so beautiful. I was in tears. It was so beautiful to see that there is such a strong feeling of, yes, we want peace. We want peace for ourselves, for our communities, for our countries, and for our world. So I really invite you to start that here and now, and we'll move into the peace side. So Miriam, would you like to come? I'm going to give you the mic so that the people on the side.
So just to let you know, this is going to be a little organic. It's not a choreographed process because we didn't have the opportunity to rehearse. So Benny, who is a wonderful elder of the peace community, not just here, but around Australia and around the world, is going to help to lead us. And so I'm going to ask you a bit to move over here. So we are going to move forward in a line, which will come back and spiral on itself, and we will gradually become a circle. And then I will call some people to come to make that center symbol. So not that I'm privileging any group, but mainly because the wife would be mainly at the heart of that symbol. At the heart of here, the drone will be the main ones. So basically we'll do this one. We will then form the symbol. Benny will have a beautiful flag that does beautiful dance flag, which is a tradition that Benny learned in America. And I will just lead some simple movements altogether. You can't make a mistake with this. This is basically we'll try to follow on something very simple. Then we will, from that, then we will come back into our circle and we will do something called a whoosh. Some people have already done a whoosh. And then after the whoosh, I will ask you to do one of two things. To find somebody that you haven't met before, talk to them. What did you come? What were you hoping for? What brought you here? What were your feelings in doing it? And what are you feeling after making the peace symbol? And the other is that there will be a banner here. Peace symbols, right? Their thoughts about peace, thoughts about what they learned. So that's pretty much it. So it might feel a little bit messy as we get into this, but once we get into the circle and then the peace symbol, it will be okay. So and from the air, it will look so beautiful once we get into that. So questions people have on, put that here out of the way. Oh, now it's fine. So can you just say we can just listen for a sec?
Yeah. So basically, me and Miriam will be leading, and people hold hands for us to lead you out in the line, and then we face into each other. So we have eye contact, and we'll sing the song "Made a Long Time Son." I'll sing it now. It's an anthem that came to a chorus before Joseph. It's like beautiful. Made a long time sunshine upon you, all love surround you, and the pure light within you guide your ways on. Repeat. Made a long time sunshine upon you, all love surround you, and the pure light within you guide your way on. So we do that as we pass through it and going until we finish it. Now,
It's on.
all right, might as well start, right?
I think so. Really to us. My husband is filming.
I'll be like a baritone bass and like it's hitting that one
So.
All right. So we go this way.
Yep.
Right, so people just join in on the end and we'll first go round, then we'll turn on each other. Made a long time sunshine upon you, all love surround you. And the pure light within and the pure light within
Okay, so I don't have that
and the joy
within the guide of the way we go. Hey, Lord, some guide the boy. Oh, Lord,
Oh, wait. Oh. If you shake a leg. Hi.
So we're just doing a bit of creation and working out how we're making our peace sign. This has been an amazing collaboration that's changed daily as different people have come in and added different flavors to the event. So we haven't even had a practice run yet, so who knows what we're going to create. But we were saying we think bringing peace out of chaos is a really beautiful way of looking at it. Enjoy.
Of course it's of course it's that one's running now.
So you've got more old timers than us. I thought yeah, one for the rest. I missed your year.
Takes me a while to recognize.
Yeah, someone needs to. They need that middle line. They need to be one.
No, that line stay there. We'll extend.
And the circle.
Make a circle around the picture. Make a circle to the people.
Rather than Here's the good news. I've already seen it from the air. The picture from the air. Another one. Yeah. That's the way we roll. Generally. So, how's it looking, Duncan? I love it. On here. You just take a picture there with the tag. Started on
That's it.
the message.
Shall we move on, Alison?
There will be some drumming.
Okay.
Flag. There will be
Sandra and team, thanks for all your hard work and you having fun in the sun. We look forward to the results of your team building up there, and lovely Lismore and all the people who live around it in the bush doing great things for peace. We're really grateful for your input. Just to take us to the top of the hour, David and I are going to do a bit of a Q&A because people are watching this around the world may be a little bit bemused. David, have you got any questions?
I have endless questions. The interview that we started with was fantastic, and I'm curious what percentage of people in Australia share that enlightened perspective, and what percentage share the perspective that the Pentagon would like them to have. What is the public opinion, and what are you all doing to improve it?
Yeah, well, that's, as they say, the $96 million question, but we don't really know because there hasn't been proper polling on this to give us the answers. But people like us who are involved in multiple civil society groups think that support for these sorts of views is growing, but if you rely on the mainstream media, which are dominated by Murdoch, you would get the impression that not only are they totally behind this AUKUS business and the rest of it, and the coming war with China, but also that they suggest the people as a whole are too. Now, we just don't know because there hasn't been proper polling done. What I can say is that there are multiple civil society groups supporting the general peace agreement agenda and disarmament agenda. And numerous petitions have been put into government and made public in full-scale advertisements around the place. But as Senator Shoebridge said, the government just ignores them. And this is what is so alarming for those of us who are looking at the future for this country. We have no interest at all in any kind of war. And while, as Shoebridge said, we live in this part of the world, the United States does not. And they can go away with their military equipment at any time. And we have to get on with our neighbours. And that kind of view is very widespread around the universities and in the more progressive media. But the mainstream media, which, as I said, are dominated by Murdoch and by commercial interests, don't appear to share it.
There seems to be something of a gap in countries like ours, I mean, Australia and the United States, where I am. You can find these scraps of something you might call democratic at the local level. You can get your town councilors to listen to you. You can't be locked up for just anything at all times. But this whole agenda of fighting the world in the name of democracy doesn't seem to have anything democratic attached to it at all. And it's run by these unelected institutions like NATO and these new concoctions like AUKUS, which I imagine will soon be bossing the governments that make it up around the way NATO does. How do they get away with claiming to be fighting for democracy when nobody in Australia has been asked whether they want to be fought for?
Well, you might well ask. And in fact, there's the talk about democracy seems to be something that obsesses your president. But here, nobody's even talking about that. Last year, the Labor Party led an inquiry into how Australia goes to war, which is something they had promised to do for a long time. And I was very much involved in that with Australians for War Powers Reform. And before it even took place, both the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister, this is of a so-called socialist government, progressive government, both said that there would be no change as a result of that inquiry. And there has been none. So in other words, the way we go to war remains the same. No vote, no democratic process at all in the parliament. And what we were seeking was a debate and a vote in both houses of parliament before any commitment to war is made. Now, they have failed to do that. And there is widespread discontent in the community about that. But the feeling is, as you've suggested, people are at a loss to know what to do when their views are so ignored. All right, next year we will have an election. Our last one was in 2022, and when the Labor government got in, we thought we were going to get somewhere. We haven't really, on this front, we haven't got anywhere. And so if there's a change of government at the next election, predictably it will be even worse, because the government that will be in power is the government that wants not only all of this AUKUS business, but they also want nuclear power for Australia, which is something we've never had and most of us don't want. The main purpose of that being, of course, to produce enriched uranium from which you can make weapons. And so groups like ours and many other civil society groups, at least 100 of them that have responded to surveys by groups like ours, are opposed to it, but their views are ignored. So in a democracy, those views ought to come to the surface at the time of an election. Now, if we do have an election before, say, May next year, that will be a time when we find out what people really do think. And the people of Australia, although I said the mass media are dominant, they have a record of making up their own minds, as they did in the last election, for instance, and not necessarily doing the kinds of things that the major parties or the mainstream media are suggesting they should do. And one of the tendencies that I think we will see is a move towards more independence in the parliament, of whom Senator Shoebridge is one. Oh, sorry, he's a Green. Greens and independents. And we have, in the last election, we developed a new phenomenon among the independents called the Teals. And these were women in various states who adopted a practice of wearing teal-coloured T-shirts, like your somewhat like your sky blue scarf, very distinctive, very recognizable. And these were sort of young to middle-aged women, professional, well-educated, committed, and they got a lot of support on a select range of issues. They wanted tax reform, they wanted transparency and accountability from government, and they wanted action on climate change. Now, we have been putting pressure, all of us, on our various independents, and my local electorate here has a Teal independent as its representative in Parliament. We've been putting pressure on them as much as we can to pick up the peace agenda that we've been talking about and the war powers reform agenda. And up until now, only a few of them, one or two, there's very strong senator independent senator in the ACT, in the equivalent of your DC, in Canberra, who is supportive of this. And I think that we're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months or so, growing pressure of the sort that we would regard as beneficial in this country.
In just a few minutes, I want to turn to New Zealand, but Alison, what about all the US bases and troops in Australia? Most people in the United States have no idea they're there at all. Probably most who do have some fictionalized, mythologized notion from television shows like Pine Gap. What do people in Australia make, and why can't we bring together the people of Australia where these bases are stuck and the people of the United States who, if they had a clue, would want the money spent on something useful, and oppose them from two sides?
That would be a terrific thing to do. And it'd be something that perhaps we could put our minds to in the next 6 to 8 months or so. In fact, it could be something on which we concentrate in the World Beyond War conference in September this year. It would be, that's an opportunity for those questions to be put to people, and for people who don't know or haven't focused on this problem to get their ideas together about how we can confront it. But let me say this, the Pine Gap and now the the growing bases that are being given to the United States in the Northern Territory around Darwin to do whatever it wants with. The Pine Gap has been there since the 1960s, ever since a conservative Australian government gave it to the United States, in effect, to do whatever it wanted with. And at first it was supposed to detect satellite communications and possible threats to Australia. But in fact, it's grown into very much more than that. And it now coordinates targeting for drone strikes in various parts of the world, as does a similar base in the United Kingdom. And so these are the things that people in Australia are worried about with Pine Gap. But again, one of the problems is they don't tell us. The information about what goes on in Pine Gap is kept ultra secret, even from ministers of the government. So you can see what we're up against. Can I suggest then, and thanks for your idea, that whatever else we might do together as two countries, why don't we put it to the World Beyond War conference and make this one of the things that we discuss there?
Absolutely. We definitely need to work on that. And thank you, Alison, for everything you're working on. And thank all of our friends who we've seen in video in Australia. I think we should move in a way to New Zealand with our friend John Rohr, who is another member of the board of World Beyond War, as well as our treasurer, who did a tour of New Zealand with help from our vice president, Liz Remerswall, who was with us earlier. I was hoping she would be here again, and maybe she will be back after we watch this video to discuss it and answer questions with John. I'm not sure why I'm seeing the screen the way I am, but anyway, I'm going to try to share a video of John Rohr making one of his fantastic speeches in New Zealand and come up with some questions. Everybody, put them in the chat or plan to raise your hand. Let's see if I can make this work.
Thank you, Professor Jackson and the University of Otago for inviting us here. This is nearing the end of an almost 5-week tour of Aotearoa, meeting wonderful people everywhere, seeing your incredibly gorgeous land, but especially for me, learning about the major contributions that Aotearoa, New Zealand has made to world peace. We'll say plenty about those. And I'm here to learn as much as I am to talk, so I look forward to interesting discussion. So I was an emergency physician for most of my career. And after 30 to 40 years of fixing people up for what they do to each other and often to themselves, I decided it was time for prevention. And so what I do now, I consider mostly violence prevention. There's lots of kinds of violence in the world, isn't there? We have domestic violence at home. We have street violence. I've heard about the gangs in the cities here. Our host has had his car stolen. Lots of different kinds of violence, poverty, structural violences. But war is in a special category. All those other things, generally people agree on, we don't like those. There's always prevention programs. How do we stop crime? How do we stop violence? How do we stop homicides? But war is a special bird, isn't it? We take our children, young men and women, and everything we taught them to do and not to do as children, we suddenly reverse that and say, no, now you have to become a killer. Now you have to blow up and destroy things in order to serve whatever interest the authorities say needs to be served. And so it's the most egregious kind of violence, and it's the only one that is a cultural decision and not something that has to be done or part of our faulty nature. It's a cultural decision. And so with World Beyond War, we try to see what makes people go to war. And in my opinion, the overwhelming answer is the fact that that's what we've been conditioned to. Basically, the propaganda. Every war movie I ever saw, every good cop show, the good guys did not win by being good. They won by out-violencing the bad guys in 98% of those movies. And that kind of belief that violence is the final arbiter of conflict is easy to believe for two reasons. One, people don't count the full cost of war. They count the soldiers dead. They might count the military budget that went into the war, but they don't count the PTSD, the treatment that those vets, or the violence they'll visit upon their families and communities for the rest of their lives, the medical care they'll need for the rest of their lives. They don't count the environmental damage. How many people are counting all the children from the Vietnam War who are still losing their legs over cluster bombing? And here we sent more cluster bombs into Ukraine. So all those costs aren't counted. I'm guessing you're all here not too worried about the cost of it, or you wouldn't be here. The second thing is people just don't know the alternatives. What do you do about the people you see as enemies that may actually, or you're perceived to be attempting to hurt you? And at World Beyond War, we spend our time looking for those alternatives and making practical use of them, educating people in them, and doing some of them. So that's what we'll focus on this evening. Why abolish war at all? Well, the single biggest reason is nuclear weapons. You know, you've seen the pictures of what Mariupol looks like. You see what Gaza looks like. In the war in Ukraine in particular, where nuclear-powered NATO keeps punching nuclear-powered Russia and back and forth, we have to remember that Putin is perfectly capable of making every major European city and every city in the US look like Mariupol in a couple of hours if he so chooses. And there's nothing we can do to prevent that. Why would we take that risk in any case? And we could talk about all the ways to prevent that besides poking the bear. The people that have followed the threat of nuclear war since the bombings in the 1940s tell us now that they think there's more risk of this than ever. And why? Because Russia and NATO are at odds. China and the US are at odds in the South China Sea. North Korea is, and I call it NATO Pacific because they forget where the North Atlantic is, but there's a lot of Pacific nations getting involved in the same treaty. India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed powers that have actually had a hot shooting war intermittently for the last 30 years. And then Israel and Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, but is constantly threatened by the nuclear power Israel. And members of the Israeli Knesset, at least one woman, actually said, we just need to nuke Gaza and be done with it. So these weapons are out there. We're renewing them all, spending lots of money on them. And praise to you New Zealanders for not getting involved with that. Other reasons, if you think magically, like the people that believe in deterrence seem to think that nuclear weapons have some magical property that, unlike everything else we've ever made, will never fail, is impressive. But if you believe that, war still kills and traumatizes all living things. It steals resources from real human needs. And many more human beings die from preparations for war, both things like nuclear testing and all that, but also just the fact that those resources, which could feed people and prevent disease, are being used to prepare to traumatize people and cause starvation instead of helping people. War damages the environment like nothing else. I mean, just look at the bombed cities. Look at Gaza now. And it's not just the buildings that you can rebuild. It's the munitions and the unexploded ordnance and all the toxic chemicals from all those explosions that are going to cause cancers and other problems for decades. Erode civil liberties. I was in Ukraine. Not everybody wants to fight for Ukraine and that, but young men between 17 or 65 aren't allowed out. There's very little political freedom or opposition parties allowed. And there's very little freedom other than to buy stuff. And then war always begets more war. And I challenge anybody here, if they can think of a time in history where one war absolutely ended any chance that those people were going to war again or be involved in another war, please let me know that war can actually end at least one section. I don't know of any that I can't describe the next war as partly caused by the last one. So World Beyond War, we're a bit unique among peace groups. And in our 10-year history, we've painfully learned that about 90% of groups that call themselves peace groups spend more time bickering about who's right and who's wrong and which weapon systems are good and which weapon systems are bad, that we said, no, war is the problem. It's not either side, it's war itself. And the battle is not between the two sides, but people who believe in mass slaughter and destruction and people who don't. We have an exception in World Beyond War. I generally believe that human beings respond better to positive inducements to say, let's work on peace, and not against something like war. But war is an exception. It is so thoroughly infiltrated into absolutely every aspect of our culture and society that we at World Beyond War believe you cannot truly work for peace if you're not also against war. We are a worldwide movement. We're not an organization just in the United States. As Liz said, she's our coordinator here. We have people working in lots of countries. We have our signatures to our Declaration of Peace, which we hope you'll all agree with and sign before you leave, in 195 countries. We're a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. And two people have pointed out, and I'll apologize up front, that you can't quite see New Zealand on our little map there, and I apologize. You're probably used to that. So our ideas for alternatives are summarized in this book called Alternative Global Security System. And we have not only the reasons we think war can be abolished, but also the things that we think need to be put in place if you want to figure out other ways to deal with potential enemies that we describe. It's in three categories: demilitarizing security, managing conflicts without violence, and creating a culture of peace. We'll talk about those some. We have a lovely graphic. I think we have some if people want to take one. A nice artistic rendition of many of the things in the book that we think need to be done in these three areas. So let's talk about some of them. Demilitarizing security, we talk about moving from a non-provocative defense away from an offensive posture, phasing out military bases, disarmament, military alliances, outlying the arms trade. You know, Pope Francis is probably the most anti-war pope since Peter, maybe. And when people pushed him, he's totally against the war in Ukraine, but he didn't condemn just Russia. He said war is the problem, and the people of Europe have really vilified him for this. And they pushed him and pushed him and said, well, come on now, you're really saying Ukraine can't use weapons to defend us? He says, well, it's not the best way, but if they have to, at least no one should make a profit doing it. And the world's arms trade is worth about $250 billion to these companies now. Economic conversion and civilian-based defense we'll talk about a little bit. But these are just good ideas. Good ideas are wonderful, but unless they can be put into practice, what good are they? So I want to point out a few examples where these things that seem radical to some people actually have happened or are happening. And if they have happened, we can do more of them. Let me give you two examples of a different way to approach your defense of your country. One is Switzerland, and just in Christchurch, we were at the Peace Bell there, and who's standing there with a lovely couple from Switzerland that we got to confirm some of this stuff with. So they have military security where every male gets trained in military defense, and it keeps a weapon in their house. And they have every road that possibly you could invade through blocked off. They have automatic bridge collapses and blockades that come down, and they're just set in like barns on the side of the road. But then if in the time of invasion, they would just come and block the road and almost make themselves impenetrable. But they don't have offensive weapons, although I hear they're going to purchase F-35s, which is clearly an offensive weapon. But for the most part, Switzerland has not threatened anybody. And the result is they haven't been invaded since, if anybody knows better, this Swiss couple didn't know, but sometime in the 16th or early 17th century. They had a civil war among themselves in 1860 or something, but before that, they haven't been invaded for many centuries. Costa Rica, on the other hand, in 1949, abolished its army. And it's I've visited most of the Central American countries. You know, when they got free from Spain, they mostly went into war, civil wars with each other, usually one side supplied by the U.S. and against indigenous people. But Costa Rica refused to do that. And the result is they have the best standard of living and have had the least crime and the least, and no wars at all since 1949. They actually were invaded once, about a year after they did this. Nicaragua invaded them, but they reconstituted their militia, pushed the Nicaraguans back, and haven't been invaded since 1949. So we know it can be done. There are 22 countries in the world that have no official army, and none of them have been invaded. So there's something else going besides hard threat power that keeps people safe. The Costa Rica story can be seen in this movie, A Bold Peace. I highly recommend everybody watch that. It'll give you a lot of hope. Phasing out military bases. So who has the most military bases in the world? Yeah. I mean, by unbelievable number. I think the next is maybe Russia with 12 or something outside its borders. China with 3 or 4. And after that, it's like hardly anybody has any. And we have, this says 750 when I made this slide from one resource, but now World Beyond War has its own database that I'll show you if we have time later, that shows them all. So what do you do about that? Let me give you an example. Montenegro was one of those new countries in NATO that Putin complained about. And when they became a NATO country, they have to start training for military NATO exercises. And they picked this beautiful mountain top, it's a huge pasture. It's the second largest highland pasture in Europe, surrounded by UNESCO natural heritage sites. And NATO came up and started firing artillery. And these shepherds and goat herds just went nuts. So we can't do this. So they started blocking, they got out with their bodies and blocked it. Luckily, they were able to enlist environmentalists from all over Europe to help protect that site. And so they had lots of people come intermittently, hundreds at some point, and block the military trucks. They found out about us, asked for help, and we did webinars with them. I met many, many times on Zoom from some of these real fighters. This one lovely young woman who spoke excellent English, her mother, you could see her on a horse like Bryce in 1881, a white horse leading everything, standing in front of these troops and stuff. It's just terrific. But we gave them our War Abolisher of the Year award for their efforts a few years ago. That got them a lot of worldwide coverage. And each government said, okay, we won't do it. And then they backslid. Finally, just in the last month, the Prime Minister of Montenegro said we're dropping all plans to do further military training there. So it can be done, that kind of resistance. Treaties. This is the first time I've been able to give a talk to people who actually know about treaties. You ever heard of a treaty here that gets a lot of attention? I mean, it's amazing. We got 2 days for the treaty celebration there. We went to Parahaka, learned a lot about, I hope that's not me. But these treaties are extremely effective. So biological weapons were banned in 1972. Chemical weapons in 1993, and the US and most other countries in the world signed these. Does that mean there's no chemical weapons? No. But it means there's not a lot of chemical weapons. The US announced this year that its chemical stockpile had been totally disbanded. It took 30 years to get rid of those toxic chemicals. Landmines were banned by a lot of countries, not the US. Cluster munitions, and this is a good story about cluster munitions, right? Because they're big news in Ukraine. Well, the US didn't sign the cluster munition treaty. And I think either Ukraine or Russia, one of them did and one of them didn't, but they're both using them now. So it didn't stop all cluster munition use, but the one factory in the United States that manufactured cluster munitions shut down after this treaty because they were so worried about not getting enough new orders. And so those treaties, even they don't do everything, like Watangi didn't do the job it was supposed to do, right? But it still matters to you all, doesn't it? It's huge, actually. And then my favorite was the nuclear weapons treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2017, when 122 nations adopted it. And then they have to ratify it over years, and it became international law for the states parties in 2021. So now, after waiting for nuclear powers who signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970 and promised to get rid of their nuclear weapons if the other states didn't get them, has totally reneged on that. And so the non-nuclear countries got together and said, we're going to prohibit them. We're no longer seeing them as a badge of honor or something to be proud of. They're not only immoral, which they've always been, now illegal. And it's given many, many people, including New Zealand, a lot of power to, and of course, New Zealand signed that treaty. Managing conflicts without violence. We'll talk about what a proactive security posture means. Instead of waiting for the enemy to come to you and hurt you, you reach out to them before they come and hurt you. Multi-track diplomacy, international law, this whole concept of unarmed civilian protection, treaties again, the United Nations, and we have a representative here who I want to hear from, and becoming a little more democratic with the way money is handed out and so forth, right? It's the IMF and the World Bank, and now China's sort of doing it. Big brother lends all this money and then everybody owes them. So what is a proactive security? How do people usually solve problems if they're not going to shoot each other? What do nations do instead of going to war immediately? Diplomacy? Sure. So just look at when the Ukraine war broke out. I didn't know anything about Ukraine, but I know a lot about it now. I said, well, why did that happen? And there's all kinds of stuff. But one of the things that happened is when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, I looked up all the U.S. military expenditure. This is just the Pentagon budget, which is about probably 80% of the total we spend on weapons, lots of other expenditures, but $16 trillion in that 20 years before the Ukraine war. Our diplomacy budget, which includes our entire State Department, USAID, all our foreign money, and our Peace Corps, lovely thing, total amount spent was about $900 billion in that same time. So if you were planning for war, planning for peace, which would you get just looking at these, how much you invested in it? And then you learn that something like 30% of the State Department budget is used to sell weapons around the world. The U.S. sells weapons or trains the militaries of every dictatorship and authoritarian government in the world, except Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba. Multi-track diplomacy, what's that? When the big boys don't seem to be getting the job done, and there's still a lot of stress like there was during the whole Cold War and the nuclear buildup, International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, which I was part of, not only gave a lot of talks to educate people and ask them, do you really want this? And if not, let's get rid of them. But they also went to the big people. So Bernard Lown in Boston and Eugene Chazov, Gorbachev's personal physician, got together and kept talking to their leaders and starting a movement and met with doctors across the borders. And it made all the difference in the world. I'm still an activist because giving talks like this is the most speaking, by the way, I've done since 1983 when the nuclear war danger was so great. We changed the leaders' minds, and since then, we got rid of 80% of nuclear weapons. How many people know that there's 80% fewer nuclear weapons now than there was in 1985? It's an amazing thing. So if anybody tells you you can't have a treaty that works, tell them you just look at history. We got rid of 80% of nuclear weapons. I didn't used to like to wear a peace sign because during the Vietnam War, there were pictures of this and it said footprint of the American chicken. And I just thought it was kind of a divisive symbol until I learned that the symbol, does anybody know this? The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain invented it. But if you know what semaphore language is, flag signal language, it's ND for nuclear disarmament. What's cool about this particular piece is it's made from a dismantled US ICBM, part of the copper wiring from the ICBM. So now I'm proud to wear it. International law. So after World War II, before World War II, whoever had the biggest army was just kind of expected to win a war and take over. That's the way it had been for all of history, right? World War II was so god-awful that people said, let's change the rules a little bit. The mistake they made, in my opinion, was they said you can no longer have an aggressive war. If you win a war, you got to give the land back. No more conquest. Which is why, I don't know if you know this, but when the UN was formed, I think there were maybe 65 or 70 nations in the world. Now there's 210. It's because you could be a little guy and not get gobbled up because it's an agreement among the nations of the world that we won't do that anymore. The mistake they made, of course, was not banning all war, because anybody know who's really good at determining a defensive from an offensive war? I don't know any war makers who can tell the difference. Certainly not Putin, and really not even Zelensky, if you look at actually what happened there. Strengthen the international criminal court. So that's to go after individuals. The International Court of Justice goes after states and makes rulings on international law. Why is this important? Incredibly important. We are at a watershed like we haven't been in my lifetime, right? Because the Holocaust was so awful. Everybody said, well, how do you prevent such a thing from happening? Well, how do you prevent any conflict? It's courts and rule of law. So people signed the Genocide Convention, including Israel and the United States and most other countries. And they said, if that law says, if you see something that looks like genocide, tell us. We don't want to know about it afterwards. And if we rule that it is, then you have to stop and other countries have to punish you for it. Literally, they use the word punishment. So it took a full 3 months, but South Africa finally got the guts to take it to court. And them doing that doesn't let them judge Israel as having genocide. I mean, all it takes is a couple of views of TikTok day in and day out, and most people think it is, but the courts are the ones that determine that. Now, did it stop Israel? And they ruled that, yes, this looks like genocide. We're going to look into this. Stop any genocidal behavior. Here's the things listed in the convention. Don't do them. Israel, of course, has totally ignored that. But see, even for us activists in DC who are confronting our Secretary of State and these Congress people all the time, they said, it's not genocide. That's ridiculous. It's not genocide. Now we say, oh, that's not your job to tell us whether it's genocide. That's the court's job, the court that you agreed to. Let them tell us it's genocide. They're suggesting it is. And it changes the conversation some. It's strength for the peace. Unarmed civilian protection. Who's heard of that term before? Okay. It's a little known concept, incredibly powerful. I studied some of this alternative stuff back in the 80s. And after teaching it for a few years, I got an opportunity in the early 90s to join Christian peacemaker teams, actually doing it in Israel and then first in Haiti and then in Palestine. And I was astounded at what 4 people can do to just get in the way of soldiers beating on people. You know, what people will do in the dark, they are less likely to do in the light. And just establishing relationships with these young Israeli soldiers and say, you know, you don't have to do that. And they almost always stop. And it takes a lot of training to do that, but less training than it takes to be a soldier. And so Nonviolent Peace Force is the first time I actually got paid to do it, which is pretty cool. Just the feeling of somebody pay you to be an unarmed peacekeeper. And I found the same thing there. You'd have 2 lines of opposition rebels and the government forces, you know, 10 kilometers apart. People would show you all the villages that they burned, and they'd all had stories of their families being killed or raped, and everybody was tense. It was a peace agreement had been signed, but they'd always broken it. And part of our mission there was just to go back and forth between the two to stop some local conflict from working out that would ignite the whole thing again. Incredibly useful. The problem is we never had more than about 8 people in one place. You know, this has to be done on scale. Not necessarily with masses of troops, but in so many places that you can always hit the hot spot. And one of the great stories, the 3 things I came to learn more about New Zealand, besides the nuclear-free zone, was what y'all did at Bougainville. Who here knows, has seen this movie, Soldiers Without Guns, or know about Bougainville? See, it's a minority still. Share that movie. Have your friends over. So Bougainville was a terrible civil war, one of the worst in the Solomon Islands area. And they'd killed tens of thousands of people. It had gone on for, 20 years or something. Multiple peacekeeping missions went in, and it broke every time. So New Zealanders, a bunch of brave New Zealanders went in, let's try something else. And luckily, the New Zealand Defense Force has incorporated a lot of Maori culture, including the haka in this. And so when these native Bougainvillers saw people that looked a little more like them doing things that they were a little more used to, rather than white people telling them what to do with guns, they broke. So they took no guns. They took guitars and haka and goodwill. And that, since I've been here, I've talked to 3 people. 1 person was there on that peacekeeping mission, Fiona Cassidy. 1 guy who was there shortly thereafter, and 1 guy who just got back from there and said, yes, everybody remembers that. They think the wonder of New Zealand. They think of New Zealand as just this wonderful country. And it's not been reproduced yet. Why? Got to figure that out. Especially when all the unarmed, the UN spends about $6 billion on peacekeeping operations. And most of them have a pretty poor track record, as Richard points out in his book. Some have been successful, but there's been as many problems. You always hear about cholera outbreaks and rapes and things. I mean, think about sending young men, take them away from their families and girlfriends, give them a gun, and put them in a vulnerable population. Is that really a good recipe for peace? And this works. Nobody got killed on that mission. So back to Ukraine, right? I went to Ukraine a few months after it broke out. I tried to go in at the start of the war, and there just wasn't any way to get in because everybody's just rushing humanitarian aid in and weapons in. But I thought Ukraine is going to resist Russia without a war. Why? Because in my lifetime, Russia owned Ukraine, right? They were just a Soviet vassal state. And they somehow got their freedom without a war and destroying their country. And then in 2004, when there was a faulty election where a pro-Russian guy got in and everybody knew it was a faulty election, people got in the streets by the millions. The movie about this I showed in my classes on nonviolent action. It was tremendous. Occupation of the streets for months and months. They demanded a new election, got a free and fair election, and another guy won. Now the problem started, that guy they elected was such a terrible politician that they voted the Russian guy back in 2 years later, and that led to the That led to all the problems in 2014, which is much messier because there was so much CIA involvement from the US. But anyway, we all saw, how many people watched the news for the first 2 weeks of the war, right? Did you see people in front of tanks and switching street signs? Anybody see some of that? And the Russians would arrest the town's mayor and the people go down and rescue them. Happened all the time. I was watching it with a bunch of other people who do this, and it was amazing. And then after about 2 to 3 weeks, it all disappeared. Why? Because this barrage of tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons. And there just wasn't any room for this. So I have a friend, Philippe Daza, who's a Spaniard. He was living in Ukraine before and for the first 6 months after the war. And his thing was to document all those episodes. And in this book, he talks about 245 different episodes where the Ukrainians resisted Russian aggression fairly effectively and categorizes it all according to the taxonomy we have now. Brilliant. He was supposed to go back and continue doing it. And I kept going because I want to go with you this time. And he couldn't get funding for it. They sent him to document how mercenary forces influenced the war. They sent him to study that. He couldn't get money to study nonviolence. So the case I went and visited people twice was at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Because whenever I talked to peace groups in Ukraine and said, what do you need from my government? More weapons, more weapons, more weapons. It gets back to that 90% of peace people actually just like to choose which side on the war and call that peace. I don't blame the Ukrainians for anything. I don't know what I would do if I was in their position. But they didn't choose much nonviolence. The exception was, I said, well, you can't take that nuclear power plant back with force, right? I know. Well, what else can we do? So a couple times I went back, and my idea, along with some other people's, was to try to get the civilians to get the local military commanders to stop shelling near the plant, which has been going on, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has been screaming about, you're going to have a Chernobyl if you keep doing this. Luckily, it hasn't happened yet. And they haven't done a heavy amount of shelling. When I went back 6 months after a frontline town right across the river where the Russians do shell, there was no more damage than there had been 6 months before, which was happy to see. So it's not a lot. If anything like Gaza was going on here, that plant would have gone up. But the point was, I found absolute, I have probably now 15 people that gave me the story. So when the Russian tanks came up in the first week of the war, the people went out like this and they just blocked the roads. The second day, they pulled trucks and burned tires and other things to block. And they went out and talked to them. They said, our mayor talked for hours and hours and hours to the military commander. I said, why didn't they just run over here? Well, our mayor was a good talker. What did they do? The tanks actually turned around and went out of sight. Came back the next day. By the third day, they were getting a little nervous. So they had all their local clergy put on their best vestments and everything and brought traditional Ukrainian gifts of friendship out. And they said, we mean you no harm, but please go away. And the Russians would say, no, we're here to liberate you. Oh, we're fine, thank you. So 3 days, and they turned and went away. The fourth day, they didn't come until later in the day when a lot of the crowd had disappeared, and then the Russians fired on the National Guard base, the armed troops that were there to protect the plant. That battle lasted about 3 hours, some deaths, and the Russians had the plant. So I asked, and nobody I talked to in Ukraine, I said, I want to talk to the people. They didn't do anything. They lost the city. No value at all. But when I talked to the people, they had the same thing. We didn't do anything. We lost the city. I said, well, let me get this straight. 3.5 days, you held off the Russian army. How many people were killed? Well, none. We got one guy hurt his leg. And I said, and you held out for how long? Well, almost 4 days. And the National Guard, 3 hours. I said, do you think that's a little courage? And shouldn't you get a little credit for that? And they'd light up like nobody had given them credit for it. So I said, well, tell me about your training to do this. Who taught you to do this kind of bravery? Well, no, it just seemed like the right thing to do because we thought the army was going to come and do it, and they didn't. And sure enough, there were people in the back readying the rifles and making the Molotov cocktails and all that. And I said, well, if you had taken that approach, how would you have done? We mostly would have been killed, he said. So you saved a lot of lives, and your city is still intact. So 0 training, 0 preparation. Now imagine if you took a whole population and trained them to resist that way, in addition to all the other proactive things to stop the enemy before they get there with tanks. So that's civil resistance. And finally, a culture of peace, telling a new story. This is critical. Then education, research, journalism, involving non-traditional actors, women, youth, and indigenous. What does that mean? Well, the news story, right? The military story is the world is a limited place and a dangerous place, and it's us versus them. And if we don't take what we need, they're going to take it from us. And in that world, might makes right. National security is what they talk about, which is always involves a war, threat of war, punitive economic sanctions. There's probably as many people that die of economic sanctions, poor people, as from wars. Glorification of military and warriors. You know, I see the same statues all over New Zealand to the Boer War and the world in Gallipoli, for God's sake. And what do they say? You know, it's kind of vague things about honor and culture and God and King. I said, what did they die for? It's the same way in the American Civil War. I went to Manassas, you know, big famous battle. And I asked the thing, I said, well, what were they fighting over? You know, and they got some, well, they were fighting for freedom. I said, which side? You know, it was like, it's so vague about why people go to war. If you're going to go to war, you really ought to have it down like this, right? We're all interdependent. Justice makes right in a nonviolent scheme. Now, by justice, I mean, you could have what they call a negative peace, right? You can put a gun to somebody's head and you can look pretty darn peaceful because you're going to do what I say, right? That looks like peace to the guy with the gun. Does it feel like peace to you? No, of course not. Ask the Maori in 1881. No, and we believe only nonviolent action can make right, because when you use violence, when you force somebody to do something against their will, and especially if you cause a lot of trauma to their families, they will come back and get you. I can quote at least 2 American generals from Afghanistan that said, for every terrorist we kill, we're creating at least 10 more. The generals are saying that, and the politicians said, we'll keep killing them anyway. And that's what's happening in the Red Sea right now, right? The Houthis are saying, this is a genocide. The court says it's a genocide. It's our duty to stop a genocide, so we're going to stop any ships from Israel or going to Israel to supply them. Oh, you're interfering with international trade. And what's the answer? Kill them. Bomb them. Instead of, like one person said, well, you know, a ceasefire would stop that. Oh, Houthis wouldn't stop. Well, they've never interfered with trade before, and they made a public statement, we're doing this to stop the genocide. And we will stop when it stops. Oh, we can't believe that, so we'll kill them. That's actually what's happening in the Red Sea right now. And I think New Zealand is playing a part in that, if I'm not mistaken. So think about that. Common security means that nobody's safe till everybody's safe. If you look at the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, their creed, or whatever they run on, specifically says that this is for the security of Europe. And nobody's security can be bought at the threat to somebody else. That was an agreed upon principle of those 58 nations. And that was kind of badly violated in the Ukraine war in the Donbass. And it was OSCE monitors. They had 1,000 peace monitors at one time. And they did document the killing, but they weren't allowed to say who was violating the treaty, because they were both Russian signatures and Ukrainian signature. And well, actually not Ukraine, but other OSCE members wouldn't allow them to report who was actually at fault. So they were a little weak there. But the idea is people have agreed to this. If you look at Chinese statements, you know, for what they want for the world, it's always that same statement. Your security cannot be bought by threatening somebody else. Very different. When I read my security documents for my country, it's all about total domination. You know, we're God's gift to the world. That's not in the security thing, but it's the U.S. job to maintain the rules-based order, whatever the heck that is, something different from international law, obvious. It's our job to enforce that all over the world and dominate whoever opposes us. Those are the words they use: dominate, 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 all through our security documents. And of course, making friends by meeting human needs. The reason I highlighted those 3 of these, I have found deeply in what's presented as Maui culture here, right? You have Manaki and Whanangua, is it? You know, the Whanangatanga interconnectedness. And then, of course, mutual aid, you know, helping each other. And then peace education and research. There's international organizations like the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Institute of Peace Education, lots of these around. But I'm really pleased to finally get here, because I've been talking about this at every place. And here I am at Otago University, where you have the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. You need lots more of this, not less of it. Whatever it takes to fight for this, please do. By the way, we always dreamed of an academy for peace in the United States. And they eventually did one. It was called the U.S. Institute for Peace, government funded, which was great, but it's congressionally funded and they're not allowed to say anything against U.S. foreign policy. And so it's kind of anemic, but it's better than nothing. But before it got so bad, they were going to shut it down. When Reagan came in, he said, that's worthless. You know, our peace, you know, we have 4 great peace academies, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. We don't need another peace academy. You know who spoke up for the peace academy? The generals. They're the ones that saved its measly little $40 million budget. But fight for this. And of course, you have this book that I want to talk a bit about in conversation. You know, Richard and his students here have made, you know, a really good point. Let's just put this question out there. Is what we're doing with the money on the military worth it? And let me ask you this. How many people here think most of what the New Zealand military does is humanitarian work or UN peacekeeping missions? How many people? Some. This is the first audience where it's been that little, so you must be having some effect locally here. Most of it is about 80% of people say, oh yeah, that's what New Zealand does. Well, in fact, as Richard says in the book here, if you look at where the money's going to expensive military equipment that has interoperability with NATO and the US forces, and where their missions are, is it protecting New Zealand? Is it establishing peace in the Pacific? No, 80% of the missions have been in the Middle East, which how much good have they done? You know, what does all that peacekeeping, all that military action done for Afghanistan? You know, we spent $6 trillion, 20 years of misery and destroying the environment in Afghanistan and turned it back over to the Taliban. All right. What have we done to prevent the Hamas-Israeli thing? We give $4 billion a year to Israel for military hardware on top of the $20 billion they give themselves. And if $24 billion a year isn't enough to keep a couple of guys with guns and RPGs out of their border, why do we think $14 billion more will help in any way? So, great book. Highly recommend you read it and talk about it, including the wisdom of non-traditional stakeholders. And this is why it's been so wonderful to be in Aotearoa, right? Because you have this treaty with Tangi, and you have this thing that happened in Parahaka, right? And I just read Dick Scott's book. I don't know who's read that, but the British were ready to finish off. This was like, they don't quite use the words, but it's pretty darn close. When Bryce went in, it's like, this is the final solution. Anybody hear that before? Finally get rid of these pesky natives that make it hard to take the land for free. And it's been a major part. Well, women in Liberia did the same thing. Brutal civil war. If you watch this movie by Abigail Disney, it's just this handful of movies I mentioned. Please write them down and watch them at some point. But at the beginning of the movie, you see what I would view as a kind of a typical African war. Young men going at each other, shooting, lopping off arms, raping women, everybody screaming in terror. And by the end of the movie, the women who forced the government into peace, they went off to Ghana to make peace. They didn't do a good enough job. The women came there, surrounded the building, and wouldn't let them out until they made a peace treaty. By the end of the movie, the women are going, give me that gun. Yes, ma'am. The same guys that were doing the killing. Phenomenal, because they brought in women who are naturally much better peacekeepers, I think, than men. And then, of course, there's Tohu and Taviti, right? These guys, they were down to a couple thousand people at Parahaka. They had a beautiful landscape, many square kilometers of cultivated fields. You should read this stuff. If you haven't, you may have read it already, but the stuff the British were saying, these are madmen. They live in utter desolation and poverty and disease. And, a doctor went in. Is that true? He said, they're incredibly healthy. Their diet is unbelievable. They're in great shape. But they went in to slaughter them, and they were fully prepared, full military armament, fully prepared to wipe them out entirely if they resisted. Instead, they were met, with children dancing and playing and singing songs, and they did trample them. I don't think they killed too many, but they eventually arrested everybody, deported all for the small group. But look at the legacy. Read Taviti's last words right before the British came in that morning. They thought they'd come in the middle of the night. They were really surprised. They'd been up waiting for them all night. They didn't come until like 9 o'clock in the morning. But he said, it doesn't matter what they do with us now. What we did here will last forever. And now, 180 years later? Not 180, but 100 and... How many years later? 150 years later, right? People are still talking about it. They're proud of it. And look what it's done for New Zealand culture. And I'm not talking about the things like changing language and street signs or names. I mean, that's good. But what really matters is what it did for the Bougainvilleers. All those other armed peacekeepers couldn't do it, but Maori culture blended with a desire of all New Zealanders to make their neighborhood more peaceful. It's an amazing story. Getting on to what World Beyond War does besides that kind of education is divestment. All right, as long as there's money in weapons, people are going to sell weapons and make weapons. You take the money out of it, they'll stop. There's been a lot of examples. They've gone to corporate boardrooms. Well, could you make something besides these cluster munitions? Oh yeah, we can make these, whatever we have a market for. So divesting, and I was very pleased to know, just learning what Kiwi, who is involved in some way with Kiwi Saver here? Anybody know that term and has money in? Okay. Apparently it's some invested funds that you, I guess, can invest part of your retirement or something in. Well, look, in 2021, somebody asked to report how they're doing on particular kinds of weapons, and a little weak on cluster bombs. But nuclear weapons, 100%. I guess you'd expect that in a nuclear-free zone. But even anti-personnel mines. No, they make sure that none of their money, and these are their different funds, I guess, is invested in those things. That's huge. There's a big campaign worldwide specifically focused on nuclear weapons. We got our city in Burlington, Vermont to say they'll take all their funds out of any weapons manufacturers. Closing bases is a big one I talked about, Sinahavina. This is in West Paupa, this Tambraw community, was doing the same thing. They had a little community up here and the military wanted to establish a base and they fought it tooth and nail, came to us for help. We did a webinar, fundraiser. I haven't been able to get a follow-up though in the last year on this. In fact, we met somebody last night that was from West Paupa. He hadn't heard of it, but the people that were involved were very grateful for this. Our latest project is, because we have Liz here and a board member in Australia, this is huge, with AUKUS for you all, right? Because Australia, the UK, and the US want to tighten that chain around China, and Australia is agreeing to buy over, 10 years, $300 billion worth of nuclear-powered submarines, which certainly would violate their no nuclear policy. But mostly, if you were China, what would you think about that? And so New Zealand's got a big question about it. But if you want to know anything about AUKUS, Liz has information, but you could go to our latest webpage and it says, what is AUKUS? What's it about? What's involved? Why it's good or bad? And educate yourselves. So please correct me if I'm wrong here, but after 5 weeks in New Zealand, not very long, you can say better than I, it looks like the challenges I see New Zealand making with regard to the world geopolitical scene are whether to reform or replace the defense force to stop spending money on combat readiness to, in my view as a USian, support US aggression. And in general, most of us feel that our government does not represent us very well. Like 61% across the board in every poll shows there should be a ceasefire in Gaza, and the government won't do it. But to review, what are the real threats to New Zealand, and what can you do about them besides train people for combat? And then what position to take in a growing US-China confrontation. Being in DC area is a little bit scary for me because I've known how my government works, but I've never watched them work for a while. You go into a Senate Foreign Affairs Committee meeting, and I watched them grill our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and he thought they were going to talk about Ukraine. He said, okay, you just get Ukraine done with, just get it done with, because China is what it's all about. We have to beat China. We have to beat China. If we can't do it without war, we'll do it with war. That's what we need to get ready for. And that's not going to be very pretty. And they're a nuclear power. They're increasing their nuclear weapons for the first time since '63, and nobody in my government is trying to get them to stop increasing their weapons. Rather, we're using it as an excuse to modernize and make new ones of our own. We need your help. So those are 2 questions I'd love to cover in discussions. Just to finish up here, our membership is 194 countries. We have signatures on this Declaration of Peace. I'll show you in a minute. We'd love you to join us. 831 organizations. If you have an organization that agrees, please sign on. We have affiliates, that is peace groups that are working.
Well, let's stop sharing for a minute on the video. Those numbers are out of date because World Beyond War is growing fast. I think we should bring John Rohr on live and ask questions ourselves. I've got a number of great questions for John already from the chat. Rather than watching people on the video ask John questions. John Rohr is, of course, a board member of World Beyond War and the treasurer on our board at World Beyond War. And yes, we are amazingly willing to share this video. In fact, it's been for quite a long time on a wonderful website, worldbeyondwar.org, along with dozens of other fantastic videos and articles and images and audio recordings from John and many, many other people. I encourage people to spend as much time as they can on the website. John, are you with us here?
I'm right here.
Can you perhaps give an update on Zaporizhia? People were asking in the chat.
Yeah, so amazingly, and thank God for Ukraine and all of Europe and all of us, that despite being on the front line of that war, the nuclear power plant has managed to stay intact. The idea of going there and organizing civil society to protect it further was actually inspired by the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. So these are nuclear technicians who negotiated for over 6 months with the Russians and Ukrainians to get into that plant. And when they did, they were unarmed civilians protecting huge numbers of people in Europe from a disaster. So I would guess that none of them ever heard of unarmed civilian protection, but here they were, in my mind, doing it brilliantly. And so I contacted them and said, is there any way civil society can help with that? And they said, oh no, our negotiations are so top level, we can't be distracted by anybody that's not actually part of us. So then I spent a year recruiting volunteers, doing online trainings, and preparing to go to see if we could get people near the front line to join in that. And it was a great effort. The parts of the team still exist, but ultimately we couldn't get in on the Russian side. And to make it work, we had to get on both sides. We had hoped to get invitations from religious people we knew, but everybody said if it's just too dangerous, anybody that would be talking to Westerners who were under Russian occupation would be seen as spies and get in a lot of trouble. So nobody would even give us the names of people on that side. So we went to the Russian embassy and asked them, and they actually heard us out pretty well and thought about it for a couple of weeks and ultimately said, no, we can't approve you're going in there. So I went back ready to try to cross the front line because you can actually do that from time to time, but I couldn't find a Russian speaker to go with me. And so the project is still out there, but on hold. Thank God the plant is held. Just 2 months ago, for the first time, though, people actually started attacking the nuclear reactors themselves with drones. I guess somebody figured out that you could hit those reactors are pretty well protected, and it's small explosives and drones wouldn't actually hurt the reactor, but would scare the Russians. And it's nonsense. It's pretty clear that both sides are using explosive weapons around the plant, and I wish we could stop it, but thank God it hasn't blown up.
The brilliance of humans. John, you've been giving talks and lessons, and we had our annual conference last year, and we have an online course happening right now on the topic of unarmed defense, which seems critical to the argument for moving away from war. I mean, as you mentioned in your talks, there are numerous other things we could be doing other than trying to destroy ourselves. We could be proactively using diplomacy and disarmament and so forth. But what has been your experience in terms of people being able to understand the concept and learn it and incorporate it into their thinking about foreign policy and budgets and governments? The fact that there is such a thing as unarmed civilian defense.
Well, none of us grew up with it in the media, or as I said in the talk about every movie and every cop show. It's really rare. It happens occasionally, but it's really rare for people to make peace or stop the bad guys without overcoming them with more violence than they do. I studied this stuff for several years when I first learned about it back in the late 80s. But when I actually went into the field with the formation of Christian peacemaker teams and later Meta Peace Teams and ISM in Palestine, I was amazed at what a few people could do to stop violence locally. You know, you could literally go up to a soldier about to beat on somebody and talk them out of it quite often. And I said, I was so impressed when I first did it in 1995 in Hebron, Palestine, that I thought there are only 4 of us doing this work. It was astounding what we could do. And I said, oh, in 2 years, we'll have 40 people. In 4 years, we'll have 400 people. And in 6 years, we'll have 4,000, and it'll make a big impact on the Middle East. It turned out the Anabaptist and Quaker traditions that put that together just had a hard time thinking about scaling and looking at the bigger picture. So I went back to practicing medicine for a few more years and followed the development of the Nonviolent Peace Force, which was the idea to really scale this up and not have volunteers, but have actually well-paid people to do the job. And they've proven that that can be done. But they've been limited by lack of support from people who would have enough money to scale it anywhere near even a small military operation. So their money has come from the humanitarian sectors. And if you look at the humanitarian pie, I think it's on the order of $40 billion, all humanitarian aid, all the things that people through governments do and all charities together do to help each other. It's about 40 billion. And compare that to the 2.3 trillion that people spend getting ready to slaughter each other. And so they're not only are they fighting for a smaller piece of the pie, but they haven't crossed that line to get most people to believe that they can actually protect people in the way that the military protects people. And we have very few examples of that. And everything, David hates when I say this, but everything in our AGSS you can point to and say, listen, this is where it was done, this is how it is done, it's being done. Large-scale unarmed protection is something where we've really got to do a lot of work on. There's 2 societies in history that I'm aware of that actually did it. One was the Pennsylvania colony, and that's an amazing history that almost nobody in Pennsylvania knows, let alone anybody else in America. But for 75 years, the Quakers ran an assembly that said, we're not going to do war. We're not going to attack an Indian under any circumstance, and we're not going to join the fight against France and Spain and so forth. And they're wonderful to read the stories of the Quakers arguing against the king's governor and the king's military guys saying, no, you got to, your pacifism won't protect you. Well, it did. It did for 3.5 generations of human beings. And then the servants of God, the Kuta Kitmagars in the northwest frontier of India, they're the only people I know that actually put down weapons. They were a highly violent society, both among themselves and especially against the British, vicious fighters, always overwhelmed, of course, by superior British artillery and strategic thinking. But they were tremendous fighters. And a contemporary of Gandhi's, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, talked them into the way of nonviolence. And they formed the Red Shirts. There's testimonies that they had 100,000 at a time, and they stood in front of the British invading their villages. And the British gunned them down by the many hundreds. I haven't heard any stories where they were gunned down in the thousands. So here they had tens of thousands of people opposing the British, unarmed, in uniform. They would drill and march and do service to their communities. And that story's hard to find. It's in this book called A Man to Match His Mountains, and there's several others. And there's a movie called The Frontier Gandhi made of it, and I'd really hoped to show that in our current course, but it's being reprocessed and isn't quite available yet. But those are the only 2 societies that have done large, culture-wide nonviolent resistance. And it'd be exciting to see it happen again. I just wrote a book chapter in this book called Unarmed Civilian Protection, where I talk about that humanitarian versus security thing. And I think the biggest barrier is if you train people to protect themselves, then you don't need the king's armies and the president's militaries. And, most of us who really look closely realize that those militaries protect corporate interests far long before they protect the average person or population. And so the people with resources enough to field large numbers of people are pretty much not interested in doing that just yet. And how can we overcome that? And I think the secret to overcoming that is to convince people that I am safer without that weapon. And that's going to take some education. Reading all those or watching all those movies is a good start that I mentioned in this talk. And then almost everywhere there are now people doing some kind of unarmed, mutual aid, they call it in a lot of places where protests are going on. But there's a lot of it going on around the world, and I recommend you keep an eye on it. Pay attention, especially to the Nonviolent Peace Force and the Shanti Sena Network.
John, we got like 2 or 3 minutes left, and I've got dozens of questions from other people and myself, but I can't not ask, what do you mean, Pennsylvania? I thought I had the John Rohr Pennsylvania education, and I'd never heard of massive nonviolent, unarmed civilian resistance or defense as part of that story.
No, it's closer, I guess, to Costa Rica in that if you do all the things like making friends instead of potential enemies,
okay,
you don't need defense. So yeah, they weren't specifically trained in nonviolent resistance. They just agreed we're not going to kill anybody. And if you have a choice of treating people really well, knowing you're never going to be able to shoot them if they try to shoot you, you're probably not going to get in. You're going to make friends with them rather than enemies. Whereas if you think, oh, I can always depend on my military thing, then it's my military defense. Then it's less important that I stop them from any aggressive action. That all has to do with proactive engagement of potential enemies before they get there. And the world, the US and the world and New Zealand and Australia really have to look at that carefully. Do I want China to be an enemy? With its 1.4 billion people and nuclear weapons, or is there another way we can live peacefully with them?
1 or 2 minutes left. What in the heck is the United Nations deal? Do they not care that unarmed peacekeeping seems to be so effective and so efficient and so cost effective in comparison with armed so-called peacekeeping? These are governments that are willing to vote against U.S. empire, to have measures vetoed by the United Nations, to vote for ceasefires. Why is it so unattainable? Is it political or is it educational to have a movement for unarmed peacekeeping in the United Nations?
Well, the good news with the United Nations is through the work of Mel Duncan and many other people in the Nonviolent Peace Force, they have spent the last 15 years lobbying within them. And now the concept of unarmed civilian protection is formally enshrined in many UN documents and has been said this should always be a part of whatever peacekeeping the United Nations does. So that's a huge, huge step forward. Now, getting people to translate that into giving money to try it is going to take a lot more lobbying on people who have given up on war to push them to do that.
Well, let's keep working at it. John, thank you for this and for everything you do. Very, very much appreciated by many people in the chat as well. We are coming up on the last seconds of this 7th part of this 12-part, 24-hour peace wave around the world. As with every other part, I am going to momentarily stop the recording of this video and stop the streaming of it to social media channels, which means if you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, get ready to find the next one, which will start momentarily. We can't do 24-hour videos on these channels.